We go live to the 78th General Assembly of the United Nations on the fifth day. Let's listen to the statements of St. Vincent and the Grenadines Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves.
Of Trinidad and Tobago for his country's assumption of the presidency of the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly. We affirm too our solidarity with the governments and peoples of the Kingdom of Morocco and Libya at this their current hour of peril, consequent upon the recent natural disasters. We express sincerest condolences for the immense loss of lives. Your Excellencies, across the world today, in large measure, men and women are pained, gripped with melancholy, and are adrift. They are perplexed, even confused, at the complexities and challenges of our human condition, which is awash with multiple contradictions, from which arise a yearning for sustainable resolutions. Large numbers of people globally are possessed of an admixture of resignation, a sense of futility, a routinization of indifference, even cynicism. And yet, at the same time, there is resident in them, in us, an elemental hopefulness and a sense of social solidarity, a search for justice and goodness, a pursuance of equity and equality, and a quest for peace, security, and prosperity for all, not only for a privileged few in a handful of privileged nations. It is widely acknowledged that the global political economy is broken and needs fixing, not by tinkering here and there, but through fundamental restructuring of a kind that endures for the benefit of all humanity, especially those who are disadvantaged, dispossessed, or marginalized. It is widely accepted, too, that the vital Sustainable Development Goals will not be attained by 2030. Indeed, there will be a significant deficit for practically every developing country. Similarly, it is widely recognized that the climate change agenda is stalling, in some respects reversing, with dire consequences for humanity, practically in most of the vulnerable countries. At the same time, war and conflict rage senselessly across the globe. In at least one case, Ukraine, the principal adversaries may unwittingly open the gates to a nuclear Armageddon. Contemporary drivers of insecurity and conflict are all jostling in an invidious march to infamy and human misery. The expansive and expanding list includes racism and xenophobia, the continuing oppression of women under a patriarchy in too many countries, the seemingly uncontrollable chariots of artificial intelligence, the threatening pandemics and the anti-people consortia of big pharma, poverty and food insecurity, ignorance, miseducation, and disinformation, terrorism and its associated malcontents, the illegal trafficking in persons and narcotics, the subversion of participatory democracy and human rights, the failure and/or refusal of former colonial powers to entertain just and legitimate demands for reparations, to repair the contemporary legacies of underdevelopment caused by native genocide and the enslavement of African bodies, and the failure and/or refusal of the major emitters of greenhouse gases to cough up the requisite resources to the affected vulnerable countries for the required adaptation, mitigation, loss, and damage. And the list goes on. The heard melodies are troubling. Those unheard are damning. Excellencies, powerful countries and blocs of like-minded states are unwilling or unable to fashion inclusive and efficacious modalities through a genuine multilateralism to address the extant challenges facing humanity. They reflect actions in quest of a continuing imperium or an emergent hegemony are dressed up as self-serving calls for a new world order, all sauce and gall, but of little or no substance, difficult to swallow. From the rough trenches of the periphery, St. Vincent and the Grenadines poses yet again, in response, three haunting questions. What's new? Which world? And who gives the orders? In this context, the urgency of genuine reform of the United Nations Security Council is to be embraced after decades of futile bickering and foot-dragging. Surely it is long overdue for sensible compromises on this matter, reflective of the contemporary condition of our world. In these troubled and uncertain times, enveloped in limitations and weaknesses, there are nevertheless possibilities and strengths. The wise and mature leadership of this collective, the United Nations, is immediately required in this great endeavor to put things right for humanity. We gathered here as representatives of national or regional interests are not and cannot reasonably be agents of purely impersonal forces driving humanity inexorably to further peril and even damnation. Notwithstanding the imperfections of a multilateral system grounded in international law and civilized norms, we at this assembly, in concert with each other and our peoples, can be the fresh hope, the beacon, the light, not merely to inspire, but to draw out of each other and our respective peoples a goodness, a high quality and a nobility, which oftentimes we may not even know as yet that we possess. In the process, let us clear certain ideational cobwebs from our brains. It is, for example, wholly unhelpful to frame the central contradictions of our troubled times as revolving around a struggle between autocracies and democracies. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a strong liberal democracy, rejects this wrong-headed thesis. It is evident to all right-thinking persons, devoid of self-serving hypocrisy, that the struggle today between the dominant powers is centered upon the control, ownership, and distribution of the world's resources. The struggle has been and is about who gets what, when, where, and how. Civilized life and living now demands fairness, justice, peace, security, and prosperity for all. This civilized goal is unlikely ever to be satisfactorily attained if the strong and powerful continue with impunity to do what they can, and the weak and fragile suffer what they must, despite their oftentimes enfeebled resistance. Throughout history, powerful countries exhibit a certain schizophrenia. They possess and deploy all their instruments of domination, yet they are racked by bewildering insecurities, which frequently turn them into beasts of unreason to their own detriment. In this way, they overreach and sow seeds of their own downfall. In the process, sadly, they hobble humanity needlessly. Excellencies, let us accord mature consideration to a matter of immediacy in our America, to use Jose Marti's telling formulation. We urge the United States of America, our friend, the most powerful and economically dominant country since the dawn of human civilization, a nation which espouses humane values, to end its unilateral and oppressive sanctions and impositions that are contrary to international law, which have been rolled out against Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. It is also plain silly and factually incorrect to label Cuba a sponsor of state terrorism, a label prompted by partisan domestic politics in South Florida. But it hurts the Cuban people massively and unnecessarily. The sanctions and coercive measures against Venezuela, including the weaponizing of the US dollar, have caused the collapse of the Petro-Carib Agreement, which delivered substantial benefits to over a dozen Caribbean countries, including St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We in the Caribbean have thus become collateral damage. At the same time, Your Excellencies, it is long overdue for the Republic of China Taiwan to be brought in from the diplomatic cold. The magnificent Chinese civilization, through the fever of history, has delivered to the contemporary world in practical terms more than one recognizable national political expression institutionally. Surely, Taiwan's quest for participation in relevant specialized agencies of the United Nations is reasonable and ought to be accommodated. Repeatedly, Taiwan has shown itself to be a responsible member of the international community. Peace across the Taiwan Straits is an imperative for the prosperity and security of the world. Excellencies, on the bundle of issues touching on concerning climate change, global warming, biodiversity challenges, land degradation and desertification, there is a veritable Babel, a tower of Babel. There is an overabundance of sweet-sounding lyrics by the major emitters, but they turn out to be bitterly deceptive. A lack or insufficiency of meaningful corrective action by the irresponsible climate polluters, countries and companies, constitute unpardonable, egregious wrongs. Indeed, it is a species of barbarism. The upcoming Conference of Parties under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in the United Arab Emirates is a critical test of humanity's commitment to save our planet from the ravages of man-made climate change. We know the oft-repeated benchmarks and the corrective agenda. I don't have to repeat them here. In this composite package of policies and measures, a special consideration has to be accorded the most vulnerable countries, such as small island developing states in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and the poorer communities in climate-distressed areas of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Excellencies, crisscrossing the issue of financing for development in the era of climate change and the downside ramifications of structural distortions in the global economy for poor and vulnerable middle-income countries is the Bridgestone Initiative 2.2. And this has already been endorsed by the Caribbean community, the Community of States of Latin America and the Caribbean, the Association of Small Island States, and dozens of countries in the African Union and elsewhere. This progressive initiative contains creative financing proposals that would result in more resources on highly concessionary terms for the poor and vulnerable regions. The multi-dimensional vulnerability index championed by vulnerable middle-income countries include those in the Caribbean. This finds a place in the reform mix of financing for development. St. Vincent and the Grenadines urges a strong support of the Bridgestone Initiative 2.0 and the MVI by this United Nations General Assembly. St. Vincent and the Grenadines also endorses the initiative of the Bahamas to remove from the OECD, the Rich Club, any global authority it assumes for suzerainty on international taxation and related matters. Properly, they ought to be resident in the United Nations. Excellencies, developing countries must refrain from being mere prideful villagers, obsessed with immediate trifles and blind ourselves to the far more compelling issues beyond our individual control and which demand a unifying solidarity with others to confront successfully our travails. Poor, vulnerable, climate distressed and resource-challenged developing countries are absolutely fed up and insulted by the unfulfilled perennial promises of the developed world on climate financing. Excellencies, in September 2015, at our United Nations, all nations signed on to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals targeted for achievement by 2030. Earlier this week, the bundle of issues centered on the SDGs were accorded a special consideration, and admirably, a refreshing of them has been canvassed. But the critical issue of a sufficiency of financing for development, including climate financing and reparations, remains the proverbial elephant in the room to be effectively harnessed to serve the deserving. Here again, agreed commitments entered into must be translated into real actions. St. Vincent and the Grenadines has been insisting as part of the conversation on the SDGs that there must be a special carve-out for reparations from European countries for the legacies of underdevelopment engendered by native genocide and the enslavement of African bodies, horrendous crimes against humanity. In this matrix, a special focus is required for Haiti. The case for reparatory justice within the framework of the SDGs is compelling and unanswerably strong. The time for reparations has come. This demand will not go away. Africa, the Caribbean, and our diaspora, and others who hanker for a just world insist on it. Excellencies, in our Caribbean community, one of our member states, Haiti, continues to be confronted by multiple existential challenges of immediacy, lodged in the political, security, social, humanitarian, and environmental domains. CARICOM is seeking to facilitate a political solution by engaging the widest cross-sections of stakeholders to fashion a government of national unity to replace that which is bedeviled by a lack of legitimacy and effectiveness, and to prepare the way for democratic elections in a suitable time frame. The United Nations Security Council cannot reasonably stand askance from this process in circumstances in which the criminal gangs, inclusive of those with links to the government and the national police, are essentially in control of the capital city. Security supports, not an imperial invasion, are required to accompany the political consensus so as to bolster humanitarian assistance, economic development, and a more orderly way of life and living. The situation is dire and growing worse by the day. We must not allow ourselves the luxury of Haiti fatigue. Indeed, the guns and bullets in the hands of the Haitian gangs are also in the bosoms of assorted criminals across the Caribbean and Latin America, and sourced mainly from the USA. The US, the Caribbean, and Latin American governments must work together more earnestly to stop this massive flow of guns and bullets. Across the globe, resolutions to wars and perennial conflicts are urgently required. The terrible situations, for example, in Ukraine, Palestine, several countries in Africa and elsewhere, cry out for peaceful settlements between the warring tribes. It is humane and wrong for the Palestinian people to be enduring colonial domination and externally induced suffering for decades. In our America, Your Excellencies, CELAC, led currently by the pro tempore presidency of St. Vincent and Grenadines, is at the forefront of seeking to fortify our political cooperation and enhance integration efforts. CELAC is building vital bridges with several blocs across the world and countries. All this is designed to promote peace, security, prosperity, and sustainable development for all. It is vital that our shared experiences be translated into shared expressions, including institutional expressions, to get the practical work done to enhance life, living, and production for all humanity. And CELAC ought to be allowed to follow the African Union into membership of the G20. Let us be more inclusive in solving intractable problems in practical ways. I thus welcome the proposed initiative, the proposal of the European Union to initiate an institutional summit between the EU, the African Union, CELAC, ASEAN, and with the Secretary General of the United Nations. I await the details. Excellencies, the days of masters and vassals are over. The days of imperialism are drawing nigh, and the would-be hegemons waiting in the wings with their illusions of grandeur, past or imagined, are bound for disillusionment. In any new world order, the metaphoric lambs and the lions must lie down and rise up together in mutual self-interest and respect, and for a better world. This world of 8 billion people deserves better. We in the developing world reject the crumbs. There is a loaf to be shared reasonably, with equity, and we must be at the deciding and the eating tables. Those who think that we speak with our heads in the clouds are profoundly mistaken. We know that in the great cathedral of the sky, there is a sun for steeple. It illuminates our pathways. We see things clearly. Men and women who see things clearly will never give up in the pursuit of peace, goodness, equity, and justice. We do so with urgency, yet with a patience and a calm, knowing that even now the greener leaves explode, sun brightens stone, and all the river burns. As I conclude, a summation from one of my country's poets, Daniel Williams, is apt. We are all time. Only the future is ours to desecrate. The present is the past, and the past our fathers' mischiefs. In order to avoid the desecration of the future, we must be serious about the challenges at hand and work assiduously in solidarity to address them satisfactorily. To be sure, there is no perfection this side of eternity, but we can do better than we have been doing. Time is not on our side. Let us sleep not to dream, but dream to change the world for the better. Thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister and Minister of National Security, Legal Affairs and Information of St. Vincent and the Grenadines for the statement made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. The Assembly will hear an address by Her Excellency Fiame Naomi Mata Afa, the Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the independent state of Samoa. I request protocol to escort Her Excellency.
At the 78th General Assembly of the United Nations on the 5th day, he highlighted that in these troubled times it's necessary to put things right and before humanity, and that humanity should not suffer from any peril. He added that this country rejects the interference of the dominant powers and the country should struggle and resist the instruments of dominations. More breaking news